Under students, Mr. Williams here, walking and talking you through the me decade, looking at American society in general throughout the 1970s. The last three subsections dealt greatly with the setup and discussion of America's economic turmoil or downturn through the middle to later part of the decade. Lots of information there. Okay, lots of information there. I encourage you to watch the economic malaise video from Crash Course on that. John Green provides probably a little bit more clarity. All right, of course, they got all the bells and whistles and editing features, and they have an entire script and a team of writers. I'm just trying to regurgitate for you my thoughts into this screencast. So it's the person most from the classroom walking you, talking to through the information. But in short, our American economy takes a downturn, somewhat unexpected. All right, somewhat unexpected, catalyzed by the spike in fuel costs. And we're basically caught unprepared and not able to compete with some of the other vibrant economies that we assisted in the creation of. All right. There's some unfortunate economic policy in place by the national government early on that we try to change. There's additional policy that is proposed but is not enacted. And then finally, we get to a point where things are stagnant enough that we bite the bullet and impart some change, some deregulation, some tax cuts, the spike in interest rates. But it can't cause things to happen fast enough in order to save Jimmy Carter and get him reelected in 1980. More on that to come, though. All right, more on that to come. But I recap America's economic downturn because it's going to weigh heavily on the American psyche and in general American society through this decade, okay? As we move from the picturesque, affluent, prosperous society of conformity in the 1950s to an era of significant change through the 1960s, into a decade where everybody goes, to hell with everybody else and the greater good. I want to worry about me, okay? What's it matter if I self-sacrifice for the United States of America, all right? What's it matter, okay, about politics, about governance? They're all corrupt, crooks anyways. So we get to a decade, all right, where maybe affluency isn't as rampant as it once was, but there is a bigger and greater push to worrying about one's self in comparison to one's nation. Let me get going here. I get to the next slide. Gosh darn it. I didn't want slide view, but we're going to have to do that. Go to the navigator. Ba-boom. Okay. So what was considered radical by the later part of the 60s, long hair, sideburns, drug usage, it becomes much more mainstream and commonplace in the 1970s. Just in general, the idea that the American youth is supposed to be rebellious and full of angst becomes more commonplace and accepted in the 1970s. Heck, just youth in general, not just the American teen. You were supposed to, challenge the man, the establishment, the institutions that gave way to the, distress and the disillusionment that individuals had with their nation and with the systems in the mid to later part of this decade. The American youth that kind of wore their hair long, all right, might have listened to rock and roll, dressed flamboyantly in the late 60s, and a statement to stick it to the man, all right, to be outwardly resistant to conformity. That was an effort to, have their voice heard politically and socially. In the 1970s, the American youth in general, all right, could have cared less about politics and social issues, all right? Now, there are going to be some significant movements that take place through the 70s to give a voice to certain minority groups in the United States of America. But the hippie generation, a highly idealistic hippie generation of the late 60s, early 70s, it's no more, okay? It's no more come the mid to late 1970s. Because collectively, many Americans are just kind of blah when it comes to their society, American exceptionalism, some of these basic tenets of our American social structure that we've discussed over the last several sections of study. The seriousness of the 60s gave way to personal fun in the 1970s. We started to see bell-bottoms, loud colors, platform shoes, polyester leisure suits. Rock music itself diversifies to appeal to the personal me attitude of many Americans, okay? Hard rock, there's soft rock, punk rock, disco, all of them to a degree labeled as rock and roll, but all of them kind of break away from that central, axle that was rock and roll music, the mainstream sound of the hippie generation in the late 60s, early 1970s, okay? So where rock music kind of personified that hippie counterculture of the tumultuous, very stormy 1960s. Rock and roll, again, kind of signifies the changing of American society in the younger age brackets as it diversifies and starts to diverge, if you will, into different subgenres. Got a video here of the Village People, prominent disco band from the late part of the decade. I recommend you watching this in the Google Slides that are in the Google Classroom. There's some fabulous commentary from the members of the Village People about what disco meant to them, how it represented their segment of society during this decade. Next slide we have here, some of the radical social and political issues that did become mainstream. So we say collectively that there wasn't like this huge push anymore, that Americans were exhausted from the tumultuous period of 64 through 74, Vietnam, civil rights, Watergate. They're just, all right, exhausted from all of that. There's not a huge push societally for advancement socially and politically that there once was. That doesn't mean it didn't exist, but it's not like this collective, effort that we saw the previous decade. Where we did see some effort to advance the status of minority groups, the women's rights and feminist movement. You can read about that in section 21.2. Highly encourage you to do so. Environmentalism, the institution of the EPA and Earth Day, that is born in the 1970s. You can read about that in 21.4. And finally, the civil rights movement in general in regards to other minority groups, Chicanos, Native Americans, and the LGBTQ community, gay rights. A lot of those gained traction and a foothold in the 1970s, kind of not in the shadows, all right, but to a lesser degree than all of the effort that was made for social and political advancement for certain minority groups and certain segments of the American population during the mid to late 1960s. Great little video here about I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar. A little music clip. You can watch that in the Google Slides as well. But again, just women's rights, okay? The Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, that is more of a front burner topic early to mid 1970s. Television in the 1970s. Remember, TV came about in the 1950s and gave us mass culture. All right, gave us mass culture to a greater degree than the radio set. Television in the 1970s hits both ends of the spectrum when it comes to being very serious and sincere about some of the social situations that Americans were experiencing. Okay, so when Americans were exhausted from individually following it and or working towards imparting change, television picks up the slack and starts to kind of utilize that exhaustion and or continued commentary in regards to some of these civil rights efforts, okay? They pick up the commentary in regards to America's social interaction, the discussion, the consciousness, and they use it to develop television series that are extremely and wildly popular. Television in the early 1970s was a bit more preachy, a bit more sincere. By the late 1970s, exhaustion in regards to social advancement and political integrity had just gotten so intense that Americans don't want to be bothered with such sincere commentary on the television set. So television becomes pretty silly, slapstick, and stupid. All right, but at the beginning of the decade, we've got classic television series like All in the Family. Can't recommend All in the Family enough. Where you have some conversations on some television series today regarding race, regarding certain minority standing in American society. All in the Family was decades ahead of its time. Highly recommend the episode of television from CNN's The 70s. It does a great job describing some of these series like All in the Family, Maude, MASH. MASH was wildly popular. MASH documented medical unit in the Korean War. Just a lot of the, in a humorous tone, was able to, describe and discuss some of the real sincere issues in regards to just humanity in general. And then, of course, Sanford and Son touched on Black life, minority life in the US of A during the early to mid 1970s. So television, sitcoms, even dramas, and the early part to the middle part of the decade, relatively serious, preachy. Of course, they were going to, make light of certain things for comedic relief. But for the most part, these were social commentaries that assisted Americans in kind of navigating through the, ever-evolving situation in the US of A. By the late 70s, you get stuff like Dukes of Hazzard, Love Boat, Charlie's Angel, Fantasy Island, stuff that was just, completely not out there. All right, but put together to essentially just kind of entertain you. Same thing in television where we get, stuff like Happy Days, okay? We start to get that sentimental approach like, gosh, remember when things were just easier, better, not as difficult. So there's a bit of slapstick, humor, silliness in the late 70s and sentiment as well. Movies follow suit. Early on in the decade, we got stuff like Jaws, Rocky, The Godfather, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, fabulous Jack Nicholson there, kind of talking about mental illness. But by the later part of the decade, we get stuff like Halloween, Animal House, Saturday Night Fever, disco flick, if you will, and Grease with John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John. So in terms of entertainment in American society, we've got television, music, and movies kind of all being a bit more sincere, providing some guidance and clarity in regards to America's social commentary. And at the end of the decade, to heck with all of that. Let's have fun. Let's enjoy ourselves. Let's worry more about us. And, whatever entertainment you want, we can provide for you. That kind of does it for a snapshot of the me decade. Again, we'll use the Zoom meetings to kind of provide some clarity to this, trying to keep these things around 10 minutes. It's a struggle for me because there's a lot going on up here that I'm trying to put into the screen and share with you right now. But check in the Zoom meetings. If any of this, is difficult to follow, email me. Have no problem trying to provide some clarity and additional explanation when I can. Okay? That does it for this subsection.